In the flickering lantern light, Tsubasa, the haiku assassin, knelt at the edge of a darkened alleyway. His breath was steady, his hand poised just above the dagger at his side. It was a quiet night in Edo, too quiet, yet the world hummed with anticipation, as if it too knew what was about to unfold. He was not a man of violence, or at least he hadn't started that way. He was a poet first, and a killer second. His words were delicate and precise, each syllable like a drop of ink on parchment, forming verses that were as sharp as any sword. Each haiku he left at the scene of his killings carried a weight that no blade could match. A message, a puzzle, a signature. Tonight, he had been hired by the Shogunate. The target was a corrupt merchant, a man who had betrayed his own people. But for Tsubasa, there was no joy in these deaths, only duty. The haikus he wrote, he reasoned, were not merely for poetic beauty. They were messages to the world. They revealed the truth that his blade struck down, bringing closure where the corrupt would thrive. His target, Kiyoshi, a man of wealth and power, was known for his ruthless dealings with the underworld. But the moment he entered the alley, Tsubasa felt no anger, no fire of righteous vengeance. There was only cold precision. The merchant walked by, oblivious to his fate. Tsubasa drew his blade with a quiet swish, his footsteps echoing softly against the cobblestones. He moved swiftly, 3 precise strikes, one to the throat, another to the heart, and a final one to sever the man's life thread. Kiyoshi crumpled to the ground, his lifeblood staining the stone beneath him. A single sigh escaped Tsubasa's lips. The deed was done, but the ritual wasn't complete. He crouched down, his fingers brushing over Kiyoshi's body, as if looking for something he could not find. His hand hovered over the merchant's chest. He reached into his robe, pulling out a small brush and a piece of parchment. In the silence of the alley, Tsubasa wrote, "Silent wind, strong and cold. The merchant's heart is now still. The world turns unbent." The haiku, simple yet evocative, was Tsubasa's mark. It was the final touch, a reminder that no one escaped fate, not even the powerful who thought themselves untouchable. Tsubasa tucked the parchment into the folds of the merchant's robes. He did it methodically, the motion fluid, as if this act were as natural to him as breathing. It wasn't just about the kill, it was about the story that followed. The haiku was the story. The sword was the end of the story. But here's the thing. Does the story really end with the kill? The way Tsubasa saw it, every assassination was a new beginning, a chance to weave a new layer into the tapestry of Edo's dark undercurrents. He wasn't just a man carrying out missions for coin. Oh no, he was an artist, a chronicler of a world steeped in shadow. His haikus weren't just random lines, they were codes. They were confessions. They were the whispered words of the dead, trying to reach the living. Could a man be both killer and poet? Could art still flourish amidst darkness? As Tsubasa stood up and dusted his hands off, he looked at the body of Kiyoshi one last time. He thought of the families who would mourn him, the men who would avenge him, and the noble officials who would approve of his death as the price of justice. But in the end, none of it mattered. Not to Tsubasa. He didn't care about justice, about revenge, or about duty to the shogunate. The only thing that mattered was the haiku, the next verse, the next story, the only thing that felt real. Tsubasa stood in the shadows of the small wooden structure, his keen eyes following every delicate movement of the tea master. He was in a perfect position to strike, unseen by all, but something about the moment made his fingers tighten uneasily around the hilt of his blade. Akiko, the woman he had been assigned to kill, moved with an elegance that contradicted her supposed association with the rebel faction. She was preparing the tea, her hands poised with the precision of a seasoned artist, and each motion seemed to carry a kind of weight, light yet deliberate. The tea ceremony was supposed to be an expression of peace, of quiet beauty, but as Tsubasa watched, something unsettled him. The way she offered the warm cup to a villager, bowing her head in gratitude for his presence, was so genuine. The smile she shared with him, the deep respect in her eyes, it was as though the world outside her humble tea house did not exist. Was this woman really involved in the underground resistance? Was she truly a threat to the shogunate, as his orders claimed? His mission had been clear: eliminate Akiko. She was an ally of the rebels, and they could not afford another figurehead to inspire the oppressed. Yet the longer he watched her interact with the villagers, the more he wondered if this was all a misunderstanding. The truth felt tangled, like the fine threads of the silk robe she wore. Was she truly an enemy, or was she merely a victim of circumstance, caught in the tides of a war she neither started nor wished for? But there was no room for hesitation in Tsubasa's world. The Shogunate had given him an order, and yet here he was, watching this woman, a simple tea master, whose presence made him question everything he had ever believed about loyalty, duty, and justice. Tsubasa leaned back against the cool stone wall, hidden in the shadows of a nearby building. His eyes never left Akiko, who moved gracefully through the tea house, her every gesture a perfect dance. He wasn't one to be easily swayed by appearances. After all, the most dangerous people often wore the most innocent faces. But what was he supposed to do when the face in question looked so kind, so utterly sincere? He'd killed before many times, and in every instance there had been something sharp, something unmistakable about his targets. They were corrupt, power-hungry, or consumed by greed. Their deaths felt necessary, like cutting off a diseased limb to save the body. But this was different. Is this it? Tsubasa mused to himself as he watched Akiko serve the tea with a quiet smile. Am I about to kill an innocent woman for a cause that may not be worth fighting for? The villagers didn't seem to mind the shogunate's iron fist. They didn't seem to resent the stranglehold of power that kept them struggling in poverty. They merely accepted it. And Akiko? She seemed content to offer them a brief respite from that oppression, a simple cup of tea poured with grace. Perhaps this was her rebellion, a rebellion of peace. Tsubasa squinted, as if somehow that would provide an answer. He hadn't expected this kind of conflict in his mission. He had thought it would be clear-cut, like so many of his past assignments. One swift stroke of the blade, and another chapter in the tale of a dutiful assassin. But now, here he was, lost in thought, caught in the smallest of moments. A woman pouring tea, a bow, a smile. Could it be that his sword, the very thing he had relied on to give him direction, was now the source of his confusion? Am I losing my touch? Tsubasa whispered under his breath, as though seeking comfort from the still night air. Maybe it was all the poetry he had been writing lately, or the soft rhythms of her movements that stirred something deeper within him. Maybe this mission was more than just a simple kill. Maybe it was the beginning of a question he hadn't yet found the answer to. But for now, the answer was simple. He had to kill her, but he didn't know how to. Maybe a haiku could help, Tsubasa thought, more to himself than to anyone else. It was absurd, he knew, to turn to poetry in moments like these, but somehow it felt right. A haiku would do, wouldn't it? A small, simple verse to capture this moment, to capture her, to capture the confusion swirling within him. Tsubasa closed his eyes, listening to the soft clinking of porcelain as Akiko poured another cup of tea. A haiku, yes, it had to be done. But what would it say? Would it reflect his doubts, or would it reflect his duty? He took a deep breath, and in that fleeting moment of indecision, found something unexpected. A shift, a subtle change in the air, a whisper of something far deeper than the politics of assassination. Tsubasa returned to the tea house the following afternoon, but this time he was not the assassin. He had adopted the guise of a wandering poet, a humble traveler seeking solace in a world that seemed to have lost its way. Akiko welcomed him into the tea house with the same grace, her welcoming smile devoid of any suspicion. She had no idea who he truly was, or at least that was what he hoped. As he settled into a quiet corner of the room, he marveled at the simplicity and elegance of the ceremony. Akiko moved through the steps with precision, each action flowing into the next, as though the very world outside the house had ceased to exist. The tea poured from her delicate hands, its fragrance filling the air, calming Tsubasa in ways he couldn't explain. It was as if time had slowed, and in that stillness, all of his doubts seemed to quiet as well. Akiko caught his gaze for a moment, her soft eyes studying him, but she didn't speak. Instead, she silently continued her ritual, the quiet clink of porcelain and the rustling of silk serving as a subtle music in the room. "So, what brings a poet like you to a humble place like this?" she asked, her voice soft and unassuming. It was a question that should have been simple, but to Tsubasa, it was anything but. "I seek the peace of the moment," he replied, his voice as steady as the brushstrokes that formed his haikus. "In a world so chaotic, even a fleeting moment of calm feels like an eternity." Akiko smiled, her eyes twinkling with a wisdom that spoke of something deeper, something beyond the surface. Is that not the nature of life? Fleeting, fragile, yet so full of meaning if we choose to see it. Tsubasa took a sip of tea, his mind racing. Her words, simple and profound, echoed in his thoughts, but they were also unsettling. What was she really saying? Was this some subtle protest against the tyranny of the shogunate, hidden within her tranquil tea ceremony? It was impossible to say for sure, but one thing was clear. She wasn't the meek, obedient servant he had been led to believe. As the conversation continued, Akiko spoke of poetry, of how it captured the essence of life, of nature, of fleeting moments. She spoke of haikus, not as mere words, but as reflections of a soul, a window into the unseen world. Tsubasa felt a strange connection to her words. Her philosophy, her quiet defiance, was in every movement she made, in every word she spoke. By the time the ceremony ended, Tsubasa was more conflicted than ever. He had come to observe, to confirm his mission, but now he wasn't sure whether he had found an ally or an enemy. Akiko had hinted at something deeper in her words, something he hadn't expected. She wasn't just a tea master. She was a woman who saw the world in ways he hadn't yet fully understood. As he left the tea house, he couldn't help but wonder what her true role was in this war. Was she a mere symbol of resistance, or was she part of something much greater? And what was he, an assassin with a poet's soul, meant to do with the truth he now faced? Tsubasa leaned back against the doorframe of the tea house, watching Akiko disappear into the back room with a tray of freshly prepared tea. She moved so fluidly, like a piece of silk drifting through the air. He didn't know what it was about her that made him feel like a shadow in her presence. Was it her beauty, her quiet strength, or was it simply the fact that she wasn't what he expected? You know, it's funny how you can spend your entire life believing in something, loyalty, duty, honor, and then in a single conversation have all of that come into question. Akiko didn't even try to challenge him directly. No, she didn't have to. Her words, the way she spoke about poetry and nature, about the fleeting nature of life, each word seemed to peel back a layer of his certainty. "Fleeting, fragile," Tsubasa muttered, his thoughts lost in the memory of her words. Akiko had spoken of life as though it were a flickering candle, here one moment and gone the next. And yet, it was in these moments that meaning could be found. But then, hadn't he always thought of poetry in the same way? A haiku is but a fleeting moment captured in time. 3 lines, simple and beautiful, yet full of complexity beneath the surface. Was this what she was trying to show him? That even in the darkest moments there was a kind of poetry, a kind of beauty? That even the shogunate's tyranny could be seen through a lens of delicate grace? The moon hung high in the Edo sky, its silver glow illuminating the narrow streets as Tsubasa walked in silence. The weight of his mission pressed heavily on his mind, yet for the first time in his life, his blade remained sheathed. He had spent days observing Akiko, blending into the crowds that came and went from her tea house. Each day, her actions seemed to defy the accusations against her. There were no secret meetings, no whispered plans of rebellion, only tea, poetry, and the quiet kindness she offered to those who visited her. But doubt was a dangerous companion, and it now shadowed Tsubasa at every turn. He couldn't ignore the possibility that Akiko might still be hiding something. His loyalty to the shogunate demanded certainty, and so he resolved to investigate further. His search began in the darkened alleyways of the city, where the whispers of informants could be bought for a price. He spoke to merchants who had crossed paths with Akiko, to travelers who had sipped her tea, and to servants who claimed to know the secrets of the shogunate's enemies. The answers he received were frustratingly vague. Some spoke of her as a figure of inspiration, a quiet beacon of hope in troubled times. Others dismissed her entirely, insisting she was nothing more than a humble tea master. It wasn't until Tsubasa found himself in a dimly lit gambling den that he uncovered something tangible. An informant, a wiry man with darting eyes, handed him a small ledger in exchange for a pouch of coins. The ledger detailed transactions between Akiko and a man known to be a rebel sympathizer. Tsubasa's heart sank as he read the entries, but something didn't feel right. The amounts were small, and the descriptions vague. Payments for tea leaves, ceremonial tools, and supplies for the tea house. These weren't the transactions of a conspirator funding a rebellion. They were the records of a woman running a business. Still, the ledger raised questions. Why would a rebel sympathizer frequent her tea house? Was it mere coincidence, or was there more beneath the surface? Tsubasa couldn't ignore the possibility that the shogunate's accusations had been exaggerated or fabricated entirely. As the night deepened, Tsubasa returned to his quarters with the ledger in hand. He sat in the dim light of a flickering candle, staring at the pages as though they might reveal some hidden truth. His loyalty to the shogunate had always been unshakable, but now cracks were beginning to form. What if his mission wasn't about justice? What if it was about silencing a voice the shogunate feared, even if that voice had done no wrong? You'd think that being an assassin would make things simpler. Find the target, end the target, collect the payment, repeat. And for most of Tsubasa's career, that's exactly how it had been. There wasn't room for questions or doubts, only action. But this time the lines weren't so clear. Tsubasa paced his quarters, the ledger resting on the low wooden table in front of him. It was absurd, wasn't it, that a simple tea master could cause so much turmoil in his mind. But that was the problem with simplicity. It often concealed something far more complex. Tea leaves, he muttered, running a finger along the ledger's columns. Ceremonial tools, supplies. These weren't the tools of a revolutionary, unless, of course, the revolution was about making the perfect cup of tea. The thought made him chuckle, though it was a hollow sound. It wasn't the first time the shogunate had twisted the truth to suit its needs. He had always known that. But knowing and accepting were two very different things. Maybe I'm losing my edge, he said aloud, though the room offered no reply. Or maybe I'm finally seeing clearly. The truth was, he didn't want to kill Akiko. Not because he was afraid or unwilling, but because something about her felt wrong. Not wrong in the way his targets usually were, but wrong in the way the mission itself felt. The shogunate had painted her as a threat, but where was the proof? So far, all he had found were fragments of a story that didn't add up. And the more he pieced them together, the more he began to wonder if he was even reading the right story. But what did that make him? A fool? A traitor? Or simply a man caught between two opposing forces, each pulling him in a different direction? Tsubasa sighed, leaning back against the wall as the candlelight flickered, casting long shadows across the room. There was something poetic about it, wasn't there? A man who wrote haikus now trapped in one of his own. A haiku of doubt. Shadows stretch across the mind. Which way does truth lie? It was a poor attempt, but it made him smile nonetheless. He didn't know what he would do next. All he knew was that he couldn't follow orders blindly. Not this time. Not when the stakes felt so personal. Not when the truth was as elusive as the moonlight filtering through the wooden slats of his window. And so, as the night deepened and the city fell silent, Tsubasa made a decision. He would delay the kill, not forever, but long enough to find the truth. Because if he was going to write the next verse of this story, he needed to be sure it was the right one.
The lanterns of Edo flickered in the evening breeze as Tsubasa approached the tea house. His resolve had grown, though it was accompanied by an uneasy awareness that his hesitation might already have drawn unwanted attention. The shogunate did not tolerate deviation, and his prolonged investigation of Akiko's innocence was a silent rebellion in itself. The tea house was quiet, its warm glow beckoning like a sanctuary inside. Akiko tended to her simple rituals, her movements as serene as ever. She looked up and offered him a soft smile as he entered, as though sensing his presence before he had even stepped inside. Tsubasa returned the gesture, though his mind was far from at ease. Every instinct told him the peace of this moment was fleeting. Night deepened, and the tea house emptied. Tsubasa lingered, helping Akiko extinguish lanterns and straighten mats. She thanked him, her voice laced with a gentle gratitude that only deepened his turmoil. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the threshold, the weight of the ledger still in his thoughts. Then he sensed a presence in the shadows outside. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable to someone trained in the art of death. Tsubasa's hand drifted to his blade as his gaze swept the darkness. From the shadows emerged another figure cloaked in black, their face obscured but their intent clear. The moonlight glinted off the assassin's sword, its polished edge as sharp as the unspoken accusation in their stance. "Tsubasa," the figure said, their voice familiar and cold. "You've strayed from the path." Tsubasa's breath stilled. It was a voice he knew well, a fellow operative of the Shogunate, sent to correct his supposed failure. "I needed more time," Tsubasa replied evenly, his hand tightening on his hilt. "The mission isn't as it seems. Time is a luxury you were not granted." The assassin stepped forward, blade drawn. "The Shogunate does not question its orders. Neither should you." Tsubasa glanced back at the tea house, where Akiko's silhouette appeared briefly in the doorway before retreating into the safety of the dim interior. He turned to face his comrade. His decision already made. "I won't let you harm her," he said, drawing his own blade. The words fell heavy in the air, a declaration that severed his ties to the life he had always known. The clash was swift and brutal, steel meeting steel under the pale moonlight. His comrade was skilled enough to force Tsubasa into the realization that his hesitation had dulled his edge. But it wasn't skill alone that drove him now. It was something deeper, something that burned within him like a flame newly ignited. He fought not for duty, but for conviction. As the duel raged, Tsubasa found an opening and struck. His blade sliced cleanly, and his opponent fell to the ground, their breathing shallow but steady. Tsubasa sheathed his sword, knowing that leaving his comrade alive was another act of defiance, a message to the Shogunate that he would no longer be their pawn. Bloodied but resolute, Tsubasa turned toward the tea house, where Akiko waited, her eyes wide with understanding. He said nothing as he stepped inside, but the weight of his actions hung heavily between them. "Here's the thing about betrayal, it's never just one moment. It's a series of small decisions, little cracks in the foundation, until finally the entire structure collapses." For Tsubasa, that collapse came under the pale moonlight, with the hiss of blades and the clash of steel echoing in the quiet streets of Edo. He should have seen it coming, of course. The Shogunate wouldn't let him dally indefinitely. He was an assassin, not a philosopher. Hesitation wasn't just frowned upon, it was a death sentence. And yet, he had hesitated, and in that hesitation, the Shogunate had seen weakness. So now here he was, facing a fellow blade, a mirror of what he used to be. The irony wasn't lost on him. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was a duel with his past self. The loyal assassin who had never questioned an order, never doubted the righteousness of the Shogunate's cause, strayed from the path, they had said, as though loyalty were a straight line, unbending and absolute. But Tsubasa had learned something in his time watching Akiko. Life wasn't a straight line. It was a winding road full of unexpected turns and choices that weren't always clear. The duel was as much a conversation as it was a fight. Each strike was a question, each parry an answer. And in the end, it wasn't skill or strength that decided the outcome, it was purpose. Tsubasa fought with something his opponent lacked, conviction. When the fight was over and the other assassin lay defeated, Tsubasa felt no triumph, only resolve. He didn't leave a haiku this time. Were no words that could capture the weight of what had just happened. Instead, he turned back to the tea house, where Akiko waited. Her eyes met his, and in that silent exchange, he knew she understood. He had crossed a line tonight, one that could never be uncrossed. But if betrayal was the price of finding his truth, then so be it. tea," Kikiko offered, her voice calm despite the storm that had just passed. Tsubasa chuckled softly. "I think I'll need more than one cup." The tea house was no longer a sanctuary, it had become a haven for the hunted. Tsubasa sat in its quiet depths, the smell of herbs and incense mingling with the faint metallic tang of his wounds. Akiko moved with practiced grace, tending to him, as though she had done so 1,000 times before. Her touch was careful, her silence heavy with unspoken questions. Days passed as Tsubasa recovered, his body slowly mending while his mind churned with doubts and decisions. He had crossed a line, severed his ties to the shogunate, and marked himself as a traitor. The weight of it was suffocating. Yet, when Akiko finally spoke, her words carried a clarity that cut through his turmoil. "They fear poetry as much as swords," she said one evening, her gaze steady. "Words have power, Tsubasa. They endure long after blades have rusted." It was an idea he had never considered. He had always seen his haikus as fleeting, ephemeral moments left behind at his kills, a poetic flourish, nothing more. But Akiko's words planted a seed. What if his poetry could do more than mark the end of lives? What if it could spark the beginning of something greater? Tsubasa listened as Akiko shared her vision. She spoke of an Edo where the people were free from tyranny, where culture and art flourished without fear of censorship or control. She didn't advocate rebellion through violence, but through ideas, through subtle, enduring resistance that would weave its way into the fabric of society. Her words struck a chord in Tsubasa, awakening something that had long been dormant. For years, he had served the shogunate without question, believing in their vision of order. But now he saw the cracks in that vision. The shogunate's rule was built on fear and suppression, and it would crumble under the weight of its own corruption if given the right push. Here's the funny thing about being a fugitive. It doesn't leave much room for self-pity. Sure, Tsubasa could have spent his days wallowing in regret, replaying the moment he turned his blade against the shogunate. But Akiko wasn't the type to let him wallow. She kept him busy with tea, with philosophy, and surprisingly, with hope. Hope. Now there was a dangerous thing. It crept into Tsubasa's thoughts uninvited, disrupting the careful cynicism he had built over years of service. But Akiko made it seem possible, like it wasn't some naive fantasy that a quiet revolution waiting to happen. "You're a poet," she reminded him one evening as they sat by the dim light of a single lantern. "Words are your weapon, use them." Tsubasa had always thought of his haikus as personal, even selfish, little bursts of creativity to counterbalance the darkness of his work. But Akiko saw them differently. To her, they were tools, sharp, precise, and capable of cutting through the shogunate's iron grip. "Words can spark rebellion," she said, her voice steady. "They can plant ideas in people's minds, ideas the shogunate can't easily silence." Tsubasa didn't reply immediately. Instead, he stared at the blank sheet of paper before him, his mind churning. Could he really turn his poetry into a weapon? Could he transform himself from an assassin into something more? "Poetry," he muttered, finally picking up the brush. Who would have thought? And so, under Akiko's guidance, Tsubasa began to write. His haikus became more than mere decorations for death. They became messages, riddles, and subtle critiques of the shogunate. He imagined them spreading through the city, whispered in alleyways, scrawled on walls, and passed from hand to hand. For the first time in his life, Tsubasa wasn't just following orders. He was creating something that couldn't be silenced with a blade. Haiku born from rebellion. The caged bird still sings, its song sharp as shattered glass, cutting through the night. Akiko watched as he worked, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You found your path," she said softly. Tsubasa glanced at her, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at his own lips. "A dangerous one," he replied. "All the best ones are," she countered, her tone light yet resolute. And so the fugitive and the tea master sat together in the glow of the lantern, their plans unfurling like the first light of dawn. The Shogunate had forged Tsubasa into a weapon, but now he would wield himself against them, not with blades, but with words that cut deeper than steel. The streets of Edo were alive with murmurs. Whispers of rebellion swirled through tea houses and markets, slipping between lips like smoke that the shogunate couldn't grasp. They spoke of haikus left on temple walls, inked onto fluttering paper, lanterns, or scratched into wooden posts in the dead of night. These verses weren't just poetry, they were riddles, calls to arms, and truths to dangers to be spoken outright. Tsubasa moved among the crowds, his face hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat. He had transformed into something more than the shogunate's blade. He was now a specter of defiance, a voice carried on the wind that even death couldn't silence. Each haiku he left behind carried not just his words but his intent, a message of rebellion, carefully crafted to evade suspicion, yet resonate with those who sought change. From the safety of Akiko's tea house, Tsubasa honed his craft. Together, they devised a system to deliver his words to the right ears. Akiko's network of patrons became unwitting couriers, carrying his haikus as innocuous scraps of art. Tsubasa's reputation as the haiku assassin lent credibility to his verses, transforming them into a rallying cry for those disillusioned by the shogunate's rule. But writing poetry was not enough. Tsubasa needed to act. He infiltrated the shogunate's inner circle under the guise of a wandering poet. His skill with words and knowledge of high society opened doors to gatherings where power and corruption intertwined. He listened carefully, piecing together threads of information, military plans, alliances, and fractures within the shogunate itself. Each revelation became a new verse, encoded and passed along to the rebels in the city's underbelly. It didn't take long for the shogunate to notice the haikus. Their officials dismissed them at first as trivial graffiti, the harmless ramblings of discontented citizens, but when the verses began to predict movements of troops and expose hidden decrees, their tone shifted. The haiku assassin had returned, but this time, he wasn't killing their enemies, he was undermining their power. The shogunate intensified its search, deploying agents to track the origin of the haikus. Tsubasa, ever the shadow, evaded them with practiced ease, but the pressure mounted. He knew that each time he stepped into their halls, each word he uttered to a high-ranking official brought him closer to discovery. The most dangerous moment came one evening at a banquet, where Tsubasa found himself face-to-face with Lord Kaga, a cunning general known for his ruthlessness. Kaga's sharp eyes lingered on Tsubasa as they exchanged pleasantries, and for a moment, Tsubasa wondered if his disguise had slipped. "The pen," Kaga remarked, lifting a cup of sake to his lips, "is a powerful weapon, but a weapon is only as strong as the hand that wields it." Tsubasa bowed his head, his voice calm despite the tension coiling in his chest. "And sometimes, my lord, it is the words that remain unspoken that cut the deepest." The encounter left Tsubasa shaken but undeterred. He returned to Akiko that night, carrying with him both intelligence and resolve. His latest haikus had already begun to circulate among the rebels, their veiled messages offering guidance and hope for every step the shogunate took to silence him. Tsubasa found another way to evade them, his words spreading like ripples at a pond. "Your haikus," Akiko said as they sat together, "are becoming the soul of this movement." Tsubasa smiled, faintly dipping his brush into ink. "The shogunate taught me to kill with precision. Now I'm simply aiming for a different target. Let me tell you something about revolution. It's not always loud. Sometimes it starts with whispers, a quiet verse scribbled on a scrap of paper, left for the right eyes to see." That's how Tsubasa's rebellion began, not with swords clashing in the streets, but with ink and paper, the subtle art of persuasion. Of course, the shogunate hated subtlety. They wanted a clean target, a neat little box to place their enemies in. But Tsubasa didn't give them that satisfaction. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost whose words slipped through their fingers like water. His haikus were simple enough to pass, as harmless poetry but layered with meaning for those who knew how to read between the lines. A phrase about the cherry blossoms hinted at a secret meeting spot. A verse on the fleeting nature of shadows warned of an imminent raid. It was, in many ways, Tsubasa's greatest work. But with great art came great risk. Each banquet he attended, each conversation with a shogunate official was a dance on the edge of a blade. The tension was exhilarating and exhausting all at once. And then there was Lord Kaga, who seemed to see through him with unnerving clarity. "You're playing a dangerous game," Akiko warned after he recounted the encounter. "I've always been a gambler," Tsubasa replied, though even he wasn't sure if he believed his own bravado. Still, the work continued. The haikus spread, and for the first time, the people of Edo began to feel something they hadn't in years: hope, a haiku of defiance, shadowed ink whispers. Each word a spark in the dark, freedom in the night.
The tea house, once a haven, stood eerily silent. Tsubasa returned to find it ransacked, its delicate paper screens slashed, and the scent of scorched incense lingering in the air. Akiko was gone. In her place was a single message left by the shogunate, a haiku scrawled in mocking imitation of his own. A lotus in chains, its petals crushed by the weight, awaits the river. Tsubasa clenched the paper in his fist, rage simmering beneath his calm exterior. The shogunate's cruelty was a reminder of their reach, but this wasn't just an attack on him, it was a challenge. They knew he would come for her, and they were waiting. Tsubasa retreated to a hidden refuge in the city's outskirts, where the rebel leaders convened to plan their next moves. The room buzzed with activity. Maps were spread across low tables, messages were relayed in hushed tones, and faces turned to him, awaiting his command. But Tsubasa's thoughts were consumed by Akiko. "We can't afford to lose you," one of the rebels said firmly. "The shogunate wants to lure you out. If you go, the rebellion could collapse." Tsubasa remained silent, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. He knew they were right. Every move he had made until now had been calculated, each haiku a deliberate act of defiance. But this wasn't strategy, this was personal. Akiko had given him more than refuge. She had shown him a world worth fighting for, and he couldn't abandon her to the shogunate's mercy. His decision came in the quiet hours of the night. By dawn he had slipped away, leaving behind a single haiku for the rebels. The sparrow takes flight, its path unbound by the wind, freedom in its wings. Tsubasa's journey led him deep into the heart of Edo, to the shogunate's fortress, a labyrinth of stone walls, guarded by soldiers and veiled in shadows. He relied on every ounce of his training, slipping through their defenses like a phantom. But the closer he came to Akiko, the more the fortress seemed to close in around him. The final stretch brought him face to face with an unexpected figure, Lord Kaga. The general's expression was one of grim satisfaction, as though he had anticipated this very moment. "You disappoint me, Tsubasa," Kaga said, drawing his blade. "I thought you understood loyalty. But it seems even the haiku assassin has his weaknesses." The duel that followed was swift and brutal. Tsubasa fought with the precision of a master, but Kaga was no ordinary opponent. The clash of steel echoed through the fortress, each strike a test of Tsubasa's resolve. He fought not just for survival but for Akiko, her face a constant presence in his mind. Tsubasa emerged victorious, though his victory came at a cost. Bloodied and weary, he found Akiko in a dimly lit chamber, bound but unbroken. Her eyes widened at the sight of him, a mixture of relief and anguish playing across her face. "You shouldn't have come," she whispered as he cut her bonds. "I couldn't stay away," he replied, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. As they fled the fortress together, Tsubasa knew their actions would come with consequences. The shogunate would not forgive such a slight, and the rebellion would face even greater peril. Yet for the first time he felt a sense of clarity. His fight was no longer just about defiance or survival, it was about protecting the people and ideals that gave life meaning. Here's the thing about choices, they're never as clean as you want them to be. Tsubasa knew that rescuing Akiko would risk everything he'd worked for, but what's the point of rebellion if you can't protect the people who make it worth fighting for? The rebels called it reckless. The shogunate called it predictable. Akiko called it foolish, though the way her voice cracked when she said it betrayed her gratitude. "It's not about loyalty anymore," Tsubasa told her as they hid in the shadows of a forest outside the city. "It's about what kind of man I want to be." Akiko sighed, shaking her head with a wry smile. "And here I thought poets were supposed to be wise." Wisdom is overrated, Tsubasa replied, though his smile faded as he looked toward the distant city lights. I've traded wisdom for hope, a haiku of redemption. Flowers in the storm, fragile yet defying fate, bloom in quiet strength. The rebels' whispers grew louder, carried through the streets of Edo like an oncoming tide. Tsubasa stood at the edge of the city, his blade at his side and his heart heavy with purpose. The shogunate's fortress loomed in the distance, a citadel of power and fear. It was here that the final chapter of his rebellion would be written, where his words and steel would converge to shape the future of Edo. Beside him, Akiko adjusted the hood of her cloak. She had insisted on coming, her presence a quiet reminder of the stakes. A poet, she said, her voice soft but resolute, must finish what he begins. Tsubasa nodded, his gaze fixed on the fortress. Then let's write the final verse. The approach to the fortress was a masterclass in stealth. Tsubasa moved like a shadow, slipping past guards and scaling walls with the precision of a man who had spent his life in the darkness. Akiko followed close behind, her knowledge of the shogunate's inner workings guiding them through the labyrinthine corridors. At the heart of the fortress, they found their target, a grand hall where the shogun himself sat upon a raised platform, his most trusted generals and advisors gathered around him. It was a meeting of power and strategy, their voices carrying the weight of tyranny. Tsubasa stood hidden in the rafters, his brush and paper at the ready. He began to write. Branches twist and break, roots strangled by greed and fear. But the forest grows. The haiku, simple yet profound, was written on dozens of slips of paper. As the shogun and his council discussed how to quell the rebellion, Tsubasa released the papers into the air. They floated down like falling leaves, drawing the attention of every soldier and official in the room. "What is this?" barked one of the generals, snatching a paper. His face darkened as he read the words. But the words were more than a taunt, they were a revelation. Each haiku carried a fragment of the shogunate's secrets, exposing their corruption, their betrayals, their greed. Whispers spread among the guards, many of whom had grown disillusioned with their master. The hall erupted into chaos. Some soldiers turned on their commanders, their loyalty shattered by the truth in Tsubasa's haikus. Others, still loyal to the shogun, drew their blades to restore order. Tsubasa descended from the rafters, his blade gleaming in the torchlight. He moved with the precision of a poet crafting his finest work, each strike deliberate, each motion a verse in a deadly sonnet. Akiko joined the fray, her movements graceful and precise, as though she were performing a dance rather than fighting for her life. And then came the shogun. He rose from his seat with measured calm, his presence commanding even amidst the chaos. Unlike his subordinates, he did not rage or panic. Instead, he stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "Tsubasa," the shogun said, his voice carrying over the din, "you think words can win wars? Let me show you the truth of steel." Their duel was fierce, a clash of ideals as much as skill. The shogun fought with the measured precision of a seasoned warrior, each strike imbued with authority. But Tsubasa fought with purpose, his every motion fueled by the hope he carried for a better Edo. As they fought, Tsubasa recited a haiku, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Steel may break the flesh, but words carve the soul deeper, etching endless change." The words struck the shogun like a blow, his expression faltering for the briefest moment. It was enough. Tsubasa disarmed him with a swift, fluid motion, his blade poised at the shogun's throat. The battle ended as suddenly as it began. The soldiers who had turned against the shogunate stood victorious, their commanders subdued. Tsubasa lowered his blade, stepping back. "Kill me," the shogun spat, his pride unbroken. "It's what assassins do." But Tsubasa shook his head. "I am not just an assassin," he said. "I am a poet. And I have already defeated you." The haikus he had scattered through the fortress had done more than expose corruption. They had planted the seeds of rebellion in the hearts of those who read them. The soldiers, the servants, even the common folk outside the fortress, all would remember the words that had unmasked the shogunate's tyranny. As dawn broke over Edo, Tsubasa and Akiko stood on a hill overlooking the city. The fortress, once a symbol of fear, now stood quiet, its banners lowered. "Do you think it will last?" Akiko asked. Tsubasa smiled faintly, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "Nothing lasts forever. But words, they endure."
Here's the thing about poetry. It's not meant to be loud. It doesn't shout or scream. It whispers, lingers. It slips into your thoughts when you least expect it and refuses to leave. That's how Tsubasa's haikus worked. They weren't just words on paper. They were seeds waiting to take root. Of course, not everyone appreciated his artistry. The shogun, for example, was more of a rule by iron kind of man. But even he couldn't escape the truth in Tsubasa's verses. In the end, it wasn't the blade that won the day. It was the words, the quiet revolution etched into the soul of a city. A haiku of triumph. The ink flows freely, weaving hope into the night. Dawn blooms on the page.
The shogunate crumbled not with a mighty clash of swords but with the quiet erosion of its foundation. Tsubasa's haikus, carried by wind and whispers, ignited a movement among the people. Each verse unspooled a truth long buried under fear. By the time the final fortress lowered its banners, the shogunate's tyranny was but a memory. Tsubasa watched from afar as the rebellion's leaders took their places in the city, ushering in a new era. He stood cloaked in the early morning mist, his presence unnoticed amid the jubilant crowds. For all his work, this was not his victory to claim. It belonged to the people, the gardeners of the seeds he had sown. Akiko's tea house reopened, its once shattered walls now rebuilt. It became a gathering place not just for tea but for stories, ideas, and dreams. Visitors came not to escape the world but to imagine what it could become. Through her graceful ceremonies, Akiko wove threads of harmony and justice, subtle yet unyielding. On quiet evenings, she found herself tracing the faint scars on her hands, memories of the battles she had fought alongside Tsubasa. Sometimes she would hear a snippet of a haiku in a customer's conversation, a verse attributed to the HaikuAssassin. Though he was gone, his words lived on, carried by those who believed in his vision. Stories of Tsubasa's exploits spread far and wide. Some said he had fled to the mountains, living as a hermit and composing poetry under the cherry blossoms. Others claimed he had traveled west, his haikus sparking revolutions in distant lands. But no one knew the truth. One day, Akiko found a single slip of paper tucked beneath a stone in her garden. The handwriting was unmistakable, the words as piercing as ever. A willow bends low, its roots deep in fertile earth. Time flows, life endures. She pressed the paper to her heart, a quiet smile curving her lips. It was his way of saying goodbye, not with finality but with a promise. Wherever he was, Tsubasa's spirit remained, woven into the fabric of a changing world. The years passed and Edo transformed. The scars of tyranny faded, replaced by the vibrant pulse of a city rediscovering itself. Tsubasa's haikus became more than symbols of rebellion. They became lessons in humanity, reminders of the fragility and strength within every soul. In a modest corner of the tea house, Akiko placed a scroll adorned with one of Tsubasa's final haikus. Visitors would pause to read it, their expressions shifting from curiosity to quiet contemplation. The verse read, "A spark in the dark, a fleeting yet timeless flame, guides the lost to light." For those who sought him, Tsubasa was more than a man. He was an idea, a force carried on the wind. And like the haikus he left behind, he was fleeting, profound, and eternal.
Here's the thing about legends, they're slippery. They're not meant to be pinned down or dissected. They're meant to grow, to evolve, to become whatever the people need them to be. That's what happened with Tsubasa. Some said he was a ghost, his haikus the whispers of a restless spirit. Others believed he was alive, watching from the shadows, guiding Edo with an unseen hand. Akiko never confirmed or denied any of it. She would only smile and pour another cup of tea, leaving her guests to wonder. And maybe that's the point. Tsubasa didn't want to be a hero. He wanted to be a spark, a beginning, a haiku of legacy. The poet fades, yes, but his verses bloom anew. Eternal springtime,